Okay, hello everyone. So let's get started with the testing effect lecture. So if you haven't already, go on to Canvas, finish that experiment, and then do all that before you watch the lecture. Okay. So oops. So what you just did was a pretty popular concept, pretty popular experiment, uh, something known as the testing effect. Okay. The testing effect is the finding that basically taking a practice test, trying to retrieve something from memory is actually a really good way to study it. Right? So when we think of tests, we think of them as an assessment tool, but they tend to be extremely useful as a means of actually encoding the information. So when we think of memory, you've probably seen this classic model here. You have sensory memory, you have short-term working memory, you have long-term memory, right? This isn't super important, but just the general framework is supposed to be that everything you're taking in gets into your sensory memory, but it fades extremely fast. The stuff you actually pay attention to enters your short-term or your short-term memory or your working memory. And if you rehearse it or if you interact with it in some way that's a good way of studying, it will be transferred to long-term memory, right? And from there, everything that's kind of you're rehearsing in your mind is going to still be in working memory. Stuff that's stored permanently or somewhat permanently is in long-term memory, right? And the whole idea has been that when you take something from your long-term memory, you have to retrieve it, right? You have to encode it and then get it into long-term memory. And then when you later want to access it, you have to retrieve it from long-term memory, right? But something that was not really paid attention to till I think it was about 20 years ago was how this active retrieval, so taking something out of long-term memory, can actually work in tandem with this idea of encoding. So if our goal is to take something, get something into long-term memory, a good way to do that is to actually practice retrieving it. That retrieval helps with the actual encoding. Okay. Hence the testing effect. That's what we mean by retrieval practice. So like I kind of alluded to before, when you think of the word test or quiz, you probably think of it as just an assessment tool, right? Something that teachers, professors, instructors, they can use to see how much you've learned, right? Something to assign grades with, right? But of course, like you said, not a lot of it, or at least not until fairly recently, not a lot of attention was paid to this idea that testing can be used as an actual study method. So obviously tests are useful in that fashion, in that they, encourage people to study. If you never got tested, you'd probably never do any studying, right? It of course can kind of be a useful tool for just assessing what you know and what you don't know, obviously. Kind of from your own perspective, right? If you need to decide what you need to study and what you don't need to study, it could be useful there, but also just to the person teaching you to kind of see where you're at. And they can also kind of encourage you to space things out. So if remember we talked a little bit last week about how spacing out your studying is a good thing to do. Well, testing might help with this, right? If you're having kind of a quiz once a week or every couple of weeks, then that's going to kind of force you to space out your studying a little bit, right? Study before, a little bit before each test. Okay. So on to the other use of tests. Well, like we said, the testing effect is a phenomenon whereby there is a memory advantage for previously learned material that has been subject to a memory test over previously learned material that has not been subject to a memory test. So just to give you a little bit of, just to give you a little bit of history here, if you go all the way back to like the 1600s, Francis Bacon was saying that if you read a piece of text 20 times, you will not learn it by heart so easily as if you read it 10 times while attempting to recite from time to time and consulting the text when your memory fails. Right? So as far back then, you know, Francis Bacon was even suggesting that actually attempting to retrieve something, attempting to remember it, is a good way to kind of drill it into your brain. Going back not quite as far, he still kind of had this idea was still floating around. So William James stated that a curious peculiarity of our memory is that things are impressed better by active than passive repetition. Okay, it pays better to wait and recollect by an effort from within than to look at the book again. So, like we said, better to be engaged in the learning somehow, right? Much better than passive repetition. Okay, but just before we go any further into our specific methodology, so another little interesting tidbit here is that the testing effect was discovered fairly a while ago, but it didn't become popular until recently because it wasn't clear if testing is actually helping or just re-exposure is helping. So let's just break down the statement here. There's a memory advantage for previously learned material that has been subject to a memory test over previously learned material that has not been subject to a memory test. Well, if you're thinking critically, the obvious question should be, okay, is that testing though, or is that just the fact that you're seeing it again, right? So if I compare two groups, one gets a practice test, one gets nothing, it's not clear. Is it just exposure to the practice, to something, to the practice test and some of the answers maybe, or is it the actual testing itself compared to a more valid control condition? So that was kind of a question, and why the testing effect didn't become a prominent area of research, at least not as prominent as it is now, till that was kind of ruled out. So typically, kind of more modern examinations of the testing effect is something along these lines. So study a list of words, and just to warn you, this example here is a little bit different than what we did, which I'll get to next. So what you do typically is you study a list of words, lint, flannel, wrapper, etc. Certainly doesn't have to be words. In fact, we'll talk a bit later about how this works for other kinds of materials. But actually, I just wanted to raise a point though while we're on this subject. Why do you think we use words in an experiment like this? If we're interested in something like studying for an exam, you know, studying for something like, well, yeah, an exam, a licensing exam, practicum, whatever it might be, why use these simple words? Seems like a departure, right? Well, and that's a fair point, and the honest answer is we do this because it's easy. Sometimes when you're looking at an experiment, you know, it's actually, you want to start with something simple. You want to start with something highly controllable, you know, highly straightforward, like single words, right? Once you've established that the testing effect or whatever it might be is, you know, is a real effect, then you can kind of take it and apply it to a more realistic situation, which we'll see later has been done. So just keep that in mind with research. Is sometimes there is a trade-off where maybe we don't want to use the most valid method because we're more interested in convenience at that time, but it's certainly not certainly good reason to do that kind of once we've established the basics of a finding, right? Remember, just like how we talked about with our incubation experiment, using, you know, that trial, those remote associates task trials. I mean, it seems almost more like a language test than it does, you know, a typical problem you need to solve. But given our sample size, given a few other factors, you know, given the time constraint, that was just easier. So ideally, we, you know, want to use the most realistic experiment we can, but, you know, sometimes it's okay to just use what's simple. Okay, so back to the methodology. So like I said, you study a bunch of words, and then you have an intervening task. And this is the manipulation here. Some of the words you simply restudy. So you saw flannel in the initial study phase, and then you see flannel again, okay? That's really our control condition, or our restudy condition, okay? In the testing condition, what you'll do is, there's a few different ways you can do this, but a common method is just to present people with the first letter of one of the words, and you have to try and recall what it is. So obviously, if you studied wrapper, you get the word W, you try to retrieve the word wrapper. Okay, that's the retrieval practice condition. Just to note, you can, so yeah, simple re-exposure versus practice. Now we ran it within subjects. Just think for a second, why do you think we ran it within subjects? What might be the reasoning for that? Well, I mean, I guess mostly just because there's no reason to not run it within subjects, right? Remember we said how between subjects designs are usually used when it's important to keep the participant in the dark, or participants in the dark, right? If we're running some sort of manipulation where them finding out what your experiment is about is a concern, then we would use between subjects. In this, it shouldn't matter whether you know about the testing effect or not. You know, I mean, we're looking for something practical here that people could use, so there's no reason, you know, so if it doesn't work, if you know the manipulation, that's kind of a problem too. But anyways, bottom line is there's no concern over people knowing the manipulation that kind of harming our results somehow, so more reason to run it within subjects. So anyways, that's what you typically do here is you'll kind of get a mix of, like I said, some of the words will be just restudied, some of them will be, you get the first letter and you try to retrieve them, okay? And you do this for a bunch of lists typically. Sometimes you'll do a distraction task like we did. This is kind of just to get your mind off the words for a few minutes, so you don't have them in your working memory right before the final test. And then the final test is just recall as many words as you can. Well, at least that's what we did. And then we kind of split up your results based on how many did you get right or how many did you recall that you restudied versus how many did you recall that you tried to retrieve, right? So pretty straightforward design. So this intervening task is the independent variable typically, and then we calculate how well you did on, you know, each on the sets of words based on how they were studied. Were they restudied or did you do a practice test? This is kind of the typical method, but we did something even a little better, which I'll get to in a second. There's lots of stuff that people have, you know, looked at here. So does the type of material matter going to the initial study phase? Does the type of test matter? Is another one people have done. You know, so for example, with the initial study phase, does it work with words? Does it work with passages? Does it work with names or languages, stuff like that? And then the intervening task, you know, so you might compare a few different methods of testing. That's something people have done. So sometimes you just have to retrieve it from memory. Sometimes you get the first letter. That's called cued recall. Sometimes you do it multiple choice compared to a restudy condition, stuff like that, right? Those are kind of manipulations that people have done fairly recently. Another interesting thing that we'll get to, keep jumping ahead, is looking at kind of different time intervals. So say the time interval between the initial study phase and the practice test, and also the time interval between the practice test and the final test. And just one more interesting thing people have looked at is the difficulty of the test. That's actually something one of our grad students here, a close friend of mine, Sarah Myers, she's done some work on this, where what's kind of the optimal difficulty of this practice test, right? You know, if it's, you could probably imagine how that would work, right? If it's too easy, maybe I don't know. Actually, I don't remember. It probably still works if it's too easy. She gave this presentation a long time ago, but I think if it's really hard, the practice test is really hard, and you don't get any retrieval, then it doesn't seem to work. You know, sometimes you also show them if they can't retrieve it. Sometimes you show them the answer, sometimes you don't. And it actually works, I think, a little bit less effective, but still works even if you don't show them the answer. Another thing people have looked at is kind of what the final test is like, and does it match with, you know, the same practice test. So say you did multiple choice for the practice test, do you do better on the final test being if it's also multiple choice? Okay. So moving on, like I said, the independent variable is going to be the type of intervening task, either restudy or in our case recopied, which we'll get to, versus testing, right? Or practice test, whatever you want to call it. Independent variable, number of words recalled. Like I said, this is all going to be within subjects, and the question is, does recall differ for re-exposure or recopying versus retrieval practice? Okay, so just to go into a little more detail with specifically what we did, we had, I think there's 8 words per block or per set. You got 5 seconds each to study them. Then the intervening task. Now, one thing that was different that we did, or sorry, half of them would be intact, half of them would be just the first letter. And you repeat this for 3 different lists. So 3 times you study 8 words, and you either get a practice. So some of them you try to retrieve them, some of them you just see them again, repeat that 3 times. Sorry, oops. And then you get a distractor puzzle. This took like 3 minutes. So like I mentioned before, the reason for that is just that we want to kind of keep it out of your working memory. So if we're kind of, you could just imagine how it's kind of a little bit about realism, where let's say we're studying for a test, right, or an exam. Typically, unless you're, you know, not really prepared, you're probably not going to be trying to recall something that you learned, you know, 10 seconds ago. That's kind of still in your working memory, in your short-term memory. So if we can kind of just delay you for 3 minutes, get you thinking about something else, then you kind of have, it's more to do with long-term memory, which is more what we might expect from, or might expect in kind of a realistic, slightly more realistic exam scenario. So then you get the final test, and you just have to recall as many words as you can. You got like 90 seconds for that. Okay. So just one thing though that we did a little bit differently. Our specific study was modeled after a paper by Carpenter and DeWash. It's pretty much the same. There's a couple differences here. I think just one difference here. I'm sorry. So ours was kind of based off of this one. It's a little bit different. You had puzzles, I think, instead of listing U.S. states. But one thing we did, which was from this one that kind of some other testing experiments don't typically do, is we had you recopy words as opposed to just restudy them. So I think so when you get the word weak, rather than just restudying it, you instead write it down. What do you think is the purpose of that? Just think for a second. You can pause the video if you want. Well, so if you remember back to kind of the original idea behind the testing effect, we talked about how it wasn't clear, is it an issue of re-exposure or testing? Right? So remember this quote, testing is better than no testing, but is that because testing is good, or is that because any re-exposure to the material is good, right? Well, and a way to, account for that is to compare it to a re-study condition, right? That way we know it's not re-exposure, it's the testing, because testing is going better than re-exposure. But we kind of took that another step, and rather than just doing that, we also wanted to control for the issue of writing them down. So think about it, it could be the case that when you see the word, the cue would say W, and you write down wrapper, well, maybe it's actually that writing that is helping you remember. Maybe it's not the act of trying to retrieve it or trying to recall it, it's the writing it down. So in our variation of Carpenter and Deloche, we accounted for this. We accounted for that as well as for the exposure part. So because you're writing down weak, now we know it's not just that you got to write it down in the testing condition if you recalled it. It's also that, it's actually that you were tested on it, that you tried to retrieve it. Because you think about it, in both conditions now, either way you're writing it down, whether it's weak or, testing, whether it's weak or hardy, both conditions you could write it down, but only one gets testing. So we know now this kind of helps clarify it further. It's not just an issue of testing or writing it down versus doing nothing. It's specifically that retrieval attempt that's helping you remember. Okay. And of course, we almost always find that people do better with retrieval practice. So getting the first letter and trying to write it down is better than simply copying it down. Okay. So let's look at how this has kind of been built on a little bit. When we kind of talk about, when you're thinking about how to expand on an experiment and you're kind of looking for new directions, well, good question is kind of how does it, what factors can modify it, right? So are there situations where the testing effect is even more beneficial than, say, restudying or recopying? Or are there situations where it's actually less beneficial? And that's something Roediger and Karpathy looked at. So what they did was they had people read these passages. I don't know what they're about. It doesn't really matter. And then, of course, people either restudied or they did a practice test. Okay? So kind of just like we did, only with some different materials, either study and then restudy, or you study and you get tested. But in addition to that, they also varied the retention interval. So how long between the practice test and the final test? Like how long between when you do that retrieval attempt and when you actually take the final meaningful test? So what you'll see here is that when there's only a short delay of 5 minutes, it's actually the opposite, right? Restudying seems to be slightly better. Okay, so this black bar here, that's when you study and then restudy. you'll see that's higher than when you study and you do a practice test. Right? The final test after that, not as good for testing. However, so that's with a really short delay. When there's a 2-day delay between the practice test or the restudy and the final test, the effect actually reverses. Now you'll see from the gray bar is much higher than the black bar. So restudying is not nearly as good as a practice test, as a retrieval attempt. And it even continues 1 week later. So you do the practice test or the restudy, you wait a full week. Now it's an even bigger difference. Now testing is even better than restudying. So that's a really interesting finding. And it also has really kind of practical applications if you think about it. So I kind of mentioned earlier how just in wanting to make an experiment realistic, maybe you want some sort of delay between the practice test or the restudy and the final test. Well, what these results suggest is that the effects of testing get better with time. And typically there will be a good time, some amount of time delay between, your studying and your exam, right? So if I'm going into a final exam, I mean, ideally, I would be studying a week in advance, right? So, and not just 5 minutes before or even a day before, right? There might be some of both, but hopefully most of my studying is done well in advance, let's say a week. Well, what this is suggesting, what these results are telling us is that testing will be even more beneficial in a situation like that, right? If you were studying a week in advance and you tested yourself as opposed to reread your notes, that's going to be even better, right, with that delay. If you're just cramming 5 minutes before the exam or even 2 days before the exam, not exactly the same. Although there is still a benefit for testing over restudying with only 2 days. So keep that in mind. Okay, so some more things to note on the testing effect. Remember, we keep bringing up the idea of practical versus statistical significance, right? So sometimes when you're testing a theory, you're just testing some concept. It doesn't necessarily matter how big or small an effect is. Sometimes as long as there is an effect, it supports what you're saying or what you're proposing, right? Other situations, it's the size of the effect is quite important, right? So maybe if I'm dealing with something like something that can impair driving performance, maybe it's the size of the effect that's really important. Same goes for studying, right? If we're going to be telling people, this is the way, as I'm kind of telling you now, this is how you should be preparing for your exams, well, it should be a pretty decent sized effect if I'm going to give that advice. If it's like a negligible effect, like let's say testing only improves your score by like 2%, well, who even cares, right? Is that even worth the extra effort it might take? Well, luckily for us, when it comes to testing, the effects are very, very practically significant. So Rowland found in a review of the testing effect, looking at 159 comparisons of restudy versus testing, on average, participants were 2.5 times more likely to remember tested info than restudied info. So that's awesome. Okay. So some other findings from the literature, kind of like I mentioned before, the testing effect is quite broad in a sense, in that it works under a lot of different circumstances. So that's another thing to think about too, right? If, let's say, just hypothetically, this isn't true, but let's say that the testing effect only works under some really specific conditions. Maybe you need, a very specific type of materials, you need a certain type of practice test, a certain difficulty level, a certain time interval. Well, that's not super good for it being of practical use, right? Because if you think about it, if we're telling students, hey, test yourself, and it only works in a very certain circumstance, well, that's not very good, because then a lot of the time they might be using the testing effect and it's not actually going to help them. But luckily, that's not really the case. The testing effect is quite, like I said, quite broad. It works for pretty much everything that I'm aware of. Individual words, word pairs, like learning a foreign language, passages and kind of extracting knowledge, from kind of a, a pretty broad explanation of something. So let's say, and this is again definitely very practically relevant, because in a lot of tests you don't necessarily need to remember a single word, but you might read a textbook chapter and have to kind of extract the important parts from it. Well, testing definitely works for that too. That's what we mean by prose passages. Information from lectures works from that too. Again, very practically useful. We want to know testing works for these other things, not just simple things like individual words. Works for learning names, stuff like math tables, you can see there. Spatial maps, which is another interesting one. And something I mentioned before is that it also works pretty well across formats. So if the practice test is multiple choice, short answer, true or false, testing still works. However, there are some differences in the size of the effect. Testing tends to be better with more retrieval-oriented practice tests. So if you were to, so like we did in this one, get the first letter, try and remember the whole thing, or just remember it from your memory, that tends to be a lot better than multiple choice or true false. But it does still, you do still get a benefit if it's multiple choice. So just add to this long list of nice things about testing, although it, can help encourage you to study, tell you what you do and don't know, tell your teachers or professors what you do and don't know. Also will encourage you to space things out. It's also a great way to study and input information. Okay. Kind of looking at this in a realistic context, Leeming, 2002, found that in an actual classroom setting, kind of incorporating testing resulted in better grades, fewer withdrawals, higher retention after the semester was over. So kind of going back to Karpicki and Roediger, this idea that the testing effect gets sweeter with time. And this one was actually a little surprising, because based on what we're going to look at next, but students also believed that they studied better for the class. Okay. So just as a side note, you can probably imagine now why I make you look at bad abstracts or bad experiments and try to retrieve, well, it's sort of retrieval, but also just kind of think critically about what's wrong with them, right? Just like the testing effect. Rather than just remind you of, hey, indent here, or bold this word, or whatever it might be, having you actually try to retrieve that is going to be much better. That's why I do it. Students also seem to like having frequent and short exams. Okay, so kind of going back to a quote by, I think it was it Ebbinghaus? Practice tests don't just assess learning, but they also boost learning. And one interesting thing is that the mechanisms behind the testing effect are not totally clear. Like why testing is so good for memory is not fully understood. It definitely has something to do with kind of passive and active reading. So you can imagine where just rereading something is very passive, you're not really engaged with it, maybe it's hard to focus. Whereas for testing, it's a very active method of encoding. You're kind of elaborating on it, and you're also creating connections. So, you can kind of use your retrieval attempt as a memory cue. That can kind of remind you of what the answer was, you have to kind of connect it to other things, whatever it might be. Okay, so let's also just look at some kind of ways people have, here at CSU, have looked at the testing effect. Something we're doing in my lab is kind of a more practical way of implementing the testing effect. So Clary, Clary is my supervisor, and me and a few other people, we've been doing this thing with smartwatches. So what people do is they study these passages on kind of random topics like evolution, the Ice Age, volcanoes, food, allergies. There's a few more, but that's kind of the general idea. And they do that for 30 minutes. They read these passages. Then they get the manipulation. They wear a smartwatch, right? And every, I think it was every minute or two, get a question on what they just read. So you can kind of see those here. In the testing condition, they could ask stuff like how many of the world's volcanoes are located on the perimeter of the Pacific Ocean. And then a minute later, the answer pops up, over half, right? That's the testing condition they get on their smartwatch. In the restudy condition, they just get the statement, right? Over half of the world's volcanoes are located on the perimeter of the Pacific Ocean. So you can see how in the testing condition, there's a retrieval attempt. The restudy condition, it's just re-exposure. And this all pops up on their smartwatch every couple minutes. We lend them a smartwatch. Later, they get they do this for like 60 minutes. Later, they get a multiple choice test. Some of the questions are factual, some are more inference based. That's not super important. It just means that some are like things you directly read. So if you specifically read that, in the initial learning phase, what amount of the world's volcanoes were located on the perimeter of the Pacific Ocean, that's more factual. Inference would be something you have to kind of figure out on your own based on understanding the passage. And sometimes memory can work a little bit differently for factual versus inference stuff. So that's why we split that up that way. Okay, and then of course, some were restudied, some were tested, and some were not shown at all, right? So we kind of have two comparisons to make, one between testing and restudying, one between, I guess, restudying or testing and not even being exposed to it again at all. So you just saw it in the passage and never again. Well, what we find is that not surprisingly, restudying overall or just any kind of re-exposure does tend to help. So a question or a statement that appeared on the smartwatch is going to be remembered better for the final test, but it's even better if you test them. Since you can see here, between restudying and control is just where you don't see the question at all beyond that initial phase of learning. You do better if you got to see it again. But again, just looking at this blue bar and this blue bar, testing is of course better than restudying. So some things we've been working on, or at least we're working on before the pandemic. Does this also work kind of while you're distracted? So if you're watching TV and every couple minutes you get the question or the statement on your smartwatch, does it still work then? And also, does it get better with time? So remember back to Roediger and Karpecki, testing effects, the longer the delay between the practice test, the retrieval attempt, and the final test, the testing effect tends to get better, right? Well, that's another thing we were looking at. So if you did this and then you waited, you did this, but then the final test was a week later, would that be better than if the test was a day later, whatever it might be, the final test? Okay. So to kind of, put this into practice, obviously practice quizzes and tests are really great if you can access them in any way. One thing I know I think if you're taking 452, I think your textbook has like questions at the end. Definitely do those. Great way to study. Flashcards is another way to implement this. If you were to say, write a definition of something on the front, try to retrieve it, and then before looking at the answer, that would be good. You can use highlighting. I'm not sure, the evidence is kind of mixed on that. But even if you were to just say highlight something in your notes, look at just the highlighted part, try to retrieve it before you read the rest and give yourself the answer. That could be a way to test yourself. And of course, ask each other questions, test each other. Just as a side note, I don't think that's something anyone's really looked at from what I know, because people do like to study in groups, I assume. I don't, people distract me, and I distract them too. But I'd be curious to know, how does testing operate when you're testing someone else versus testing yourself? I don't know if that's ever been looked at. Anyways, and then of course, kind of what we're looking at with technology and the smartwatch, another way to implement it. Okay, so I would normally have asked you, do you think students test themselves? But I'll just skip ahead and say that no, they don't. Very few students test themselves. So, and that's really a shame. So you can kind of imagine how we know this is sometimes the other half of the battle when it comes to, cognitive psych, and especially as it applies to education, is that you might discover the most awesome study strategy or study method ever, kind of like has happened with testing effects, but getting people to actually follow that method can be a whole nother battle. So sometimes the evidence is quite clear that, say, testing or whatever it might be is excellent for you. Getting people to do it is, like I said, a whole nother battle. So, when you survey people about testing or just more broadly their study habits, like 84% say they just reread their notes, reread their textbook, whatever it might be. 55 pick repetition as their number one strategy. Repetition sucks. It's not a good way to study. And only like 11% use practice testing. So that's not great. Oops. So just maybe pause the video, take a minute or so to think it over. Why do you think students don't test themselves? And there's probably several reasons, which we're going to look at in a second, but just take a minute and think that over. It just kills me not having these discussions, but why you think maybe students don't test themselves. Well, when you have people basically actually engage in testing, so there's kind of let me just back up. There's a few reasons why people don't test themselves. Or probably more than a few, but let's focus on just a few. I mean, one could certainly just be practical reasons. Maybe you just don't have access to practice questions, right? Maybe you have a textbook that doesn't have questions at the end, or there are no practice tests available, whatever it might be. That could possibly be a reason. Although I think that's probably a smaller reason, because like we just kind of talked about, there's lots of ways you can test yourself, right? You could just highlight a key term. You could just try explaining it to someone, highlight a key term, and then try and retrieve it before you look at your notes. Just make some flashcards, whatever it might be. I wouldn't say it's super hard to kind of implement some form of testing, so that might not be a huge reason. Another reason might just be that people are not aware of testing. They've probably never heard of it before. It's interesting actually, because when you go into graduate school, you don't really learn how to teach anything. You just kind of have to figure it out on your own. Like if you go into, say chemistry or whatever, physics, from what I know, they don't really spend a lot of time on how to teach people. You're too busy with your research and stuff. So it's interesting, you know, I mean, it's better at least for psych students because we are exposed to kind of some education related stuff like testing or whatever it might be. But it's interesting sometimes I talk to people who are obviously very smart people. They'll say things like, you know, oh yeah, I try to get my students to use their learning style or reread their notes. Like, those are not, rereading your notes is a bad way to study. Also, learning styles is a total myth. There's no evidence to support the existence of learning styles. So it's kind of interesting where I'm not trying to, you know, criticize these people at all. It's just kind of how the system has been established, but they don't actually, you know, you don't actually get training on what's kind of good educational methods and what's not. So, you know, it's certainly possible that people are just not exposed to good methods like testing, and they're kind of, you know, hear myths out there like learning styles or whatever it might be. But so that's certainly another reason. So two, we've kind of talked about so far. It could be, you know, partly just lack of knowledge. It could also be lack of resources. But that's not the whole story. Those are two big ones, I'm sure, at least somewhat big ones, but there's others. There's another reason. For example, one kind of consistent finding is that when you give people, you actually have them experience the testing effect, they still don't think it works, which is strange. If you give people passages and you read them and then you either restudy or you get a practice test, when you ask them to predict the percentage of the material they remember, you actually get higher predictions for the restudy condition. So that's what our Agarwal looked at. So again, you've kind of experienced both within subjects, presumably. You've restudied and you've done the practice test. When you ask people, how do you think you did in this? How do you think you did in restudy? And then how do you think you did in practice? They give higher predictions for the restudy condition. So people are basically out of touch with what's actually the good way to study. They're picking the wrong technique. So, and McCabe kind of found the same thing where, you know, if you expose people to restudying versus testing, and then you ask them which would you rather do, 70% will pick restudying over testing. So this kind of gets back to what I was saying about how it's not just an issue of lack of knowledge or lack of resources. People really do seem to believe that testing is not a good way to study. People seem to think that restudying is a good way to study. And that's, of course, the opposite of what's actually true. People always, in these studies, do better in the testing condition, yet they still think the restudy is better for them. Okay. But just another thing before we wrap up for today. What might underlie this illusion? Why are people so mistrusting of testing? Why is it that they seem to prefer an inferior method, an objectively inferior method of studying? Well, one kind of finding that might help explain this is actually from our own Dr. Matt Rhodes. He's kind of pretty well known for this study. It's a really cool one. He found something that might kind of explain this. Well, so he had people do something known as a judgment of learning. A judgment of learning is just exactly what it sounds like, where you say you study a list of words and you have to guess, okay, how many of those am I going to remember? Right? Pretty straightforward. Study a list of words, how many of those do you think you'll remember? And you do this for either words that are easy to read or hard to read. So for example, hard to read might look like this. They've done a few variations, but a font size that's makes it hard to see compared to a font color that makes it hard to see compared to words that study in an easy to read font like you see here. So again, you're doing both of those and you're going to estimate how many of those am I going to remember. Later you do an actual test. Okay, so here's what people's judgments of learning look like. Fluent just means easy to read. So fluent would be this condition, not fluent would be this condition. Okay. when people make predictions about how much they'll remember, these are not the exact numbers or scale, just this is the general point, is that when it's fluent, people feel like they've learned more. They think, oh yeah, I'm going to remember 60% of these. Whereas when it's not fluent, when it's hard to read, like here again, they think they're going to remember less. However, what do you think happens in their actual performance, their actual memory performance? Well, in this particular study, there's no difference. You're no more likely to remember words that were studied in an easy to read font or a hard to read font. So these two, they're the same, these two. But there's this illusion, right? People have this illusion that when something's easy, they feel like they've learned it. Something's easy to process, they feel like they'll remember it. Well, if people are misinterpreting fluency as having learned something better, despite it not actually doing this, well, this might kind of relate to this idea of why people don't like testing. Because if you think about it, testing is not easy in a way, right? It's not fluent. It's not a kind of easy process. That might be the answer. So when you test yourself, it's hard, right? You feel like, oh, I can't remember this. Oh, wait, I think it's this, right? Whereas when you reread it, it's easy, right? You're just reading. You can all read easy enough, especially because you've probably seen or read it before. So people might kind of interpret that familiarity, that ease of processing compared to the difficult processing involved in testing, that testing is actually bad. And you think of fluency and ease of processing as, oh, I've learned this. I'll remember this. Whereas it's actually the opposite. The harder it is for you to typically the harder it is for you to, figure something out, retrieve it, understand it, figure it out, you'll typically remember it better. Yet people interpret it the opposite way. They think, if it came easy to me, if I process it easily, it was fluent, I'm going to remember it better. But again, that's just an illusion. Okay, so that's it for today. So remember to get your data uploaded Tuesday night. Then Thursday's lecture, we'll go over writing introductions and how to analyze this data. Bye-bye.